Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Israel reports the lowest daily coronavirus infection rate in months, but lockdowns are extended nonetheless. Meanwhile, 2 IDF soldiers are injured as Israeli forces across the country reveal a number of recent overnight operations. And finally, Israel and Lebanon are seemingly starting to bury the hatchet, beginning with their maritime border. Now, starting with the pandemic again today, the health ministry is reporting the most positive news in weeks. The contagion rate for COVID-19 dropping overnight by nearly 2%. With over 44,000 tests conducted Tuesday, Israeli health officials are now reporting just 2,255 positive infections for an updated infection rate of 5.4%. This is down from 7% over the previous 24 hours and from nearly 14% this time last week, and this making for the lowest contagion rate in Israel since July. And likewise, the number of actively ill is dropping overnight to 46,491, at least 780 still in serious condition though, 244 of whom are on ventilators, and the death toll rising again to 2,067. Therefore, with infections dropping but still high, Israeli coronavirus cabinet ministers voted unanimously Tuesday night to extend general nationwide lockdown measures until midnight on Sunday, October 18. The measures, including a ban on overseas travel, extended until at least Thursday, limited public transportation, a limit on groups indoors and outdoors of 10 and 20 respectively, and the general closure of public and private businesses or organizations, save for those deemed essential. The exception to the lockdown extensions being the lifting of the 1-kilometer travel restriction for demonstrations and for wedding parties, including officiating rabbis. Professional athletes in premier leagues can also now resume training. And ministers will reconvene on Thursday to discuss lifting other restrictions next week in accordance with updated morbidity data. COVID czar Professor Roni Gamzu is recommending, however, that the current lockdown rules remain in place in red cities or cities with high infection rates for longer than the rest of the nation. And most red cities in Gamzu's supposed list are being primarily from the ultra-Orthodox sector. This as many in the Haredi Jewish community continue to ignore virus restrictions, like Religious Affairs Minister Yaakov Avitan from the Shas Party, who was caught officiating a wedding Tuesday night, or like Sanz Hasidic Rabbi Tzvi Elimelech Halberstam in Netanya, who is now reportedly the second Orthodox religious leader in Israel to receive secret coronavirus treatment from his home. Now, speaking of dropping infection rates, perhaps no community in Israel has had a bigger turnaround in such a short period of time as the Israeli Arab sector. Upwards of 26 red Arab cities going green in just a month's time. Here with more is social activist and director of Beyachad Aravim Ze Lazeh, Yosef Haddad. Yosef, I'm so happy to have you back here.
Happy to be here again.
Again, of course. Braving the contagion to be here. But of course, all right, so what has changed in the Arab community?
4 reasons. Number 1, everybody understood that the corona pandemic is serious, more serious than they thought. And I'm saying that they understood it because we came to a point where each and every one of us, unfortunately, knew someone that either died or got infected.
So it was learning the hard way. Really.
It's the learning in the hard way. So knowing that, people start to be more and more careful. Number 2, the fact is that we understood that gathering together, such as weddings, mostly weddings, that was the number 1 issues in the Arab society, Israeli Arab society, was number 1 reason for the infection. And we stopped that. Basically, we saw that drastically all over the villages and the cities in the Arab Israeli cities and villages, where literally we stopped the wedding. That was like number 1 reason in my point of view. Another 2 reasons, home front command. The fact that municipalities and the fact that the leaders in the cities and in the villages cooperated with home front command made it possible to take control over.
So it was kind of a ground-up situation in partnership with the IDF.
Definitely. Listen, we have to understand what happens before, at the beginning of September, okay? At the beginning of September, and we need to understand that the Israeli Arabs are 20% of the population. But the infections rate were about 50% of them were Israeli Arabs. That's a huge percentage that it's not even logical. When we understand what I just told you before, we started seeing the decrease in the infections, and I'm really glad to see that. And actually, this is something that we can take as a role model for other societies. But the number 4, which I didn't say, it's because we also closed the mosques and the churches as well. And one of the great reasons is the imam. He actually ordered a fatwa. Fatwa, it's a religious order, where he said that we must obey the instructions of the Ministry of Health.
Wow.
That did the job as well.
So I have to ask though, because you mentioned big gatherings for weddings as being a super spreading
and
type event and prayer, et cetera. Right. And so the holidays, Eid al-Adha over the summer was a really major event that caused a spike in infections. So right now we have upcoming though, the Prophet Muhammad's birthday is coming at the end of the month, early November. Are we going to see an uptick again, or have we learned our lesson, essentially?
By the way, not only that, in December we have Christmas as well, and we have also Hanukkah for the Jewish society. So we are actually we're going to the huge and big test in front of us for the Israeli society, not just the Arab Israeli society, not just for the Muslims, and not just for the Christians. I don't know. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. The only thing that I can tell you is I really hope that the way we treated it right now, which is a huge success, is in the November and December, the Jewish, the Muslims, and the Christians will stay united against this pandemic and say, hey, this is something more dangerous than what we thought. We will pray in our home. I hope that we will do that as well.
Yosef, I'm right there with you. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
All right, in other news, Israeli national airliner El Al is already releasing plans to reopen international flights to select destinations in light of the government's tentative plans to reopen the skies by next week. And first on the list to resume are flights that were recently canceled due to the pandemic, including routes to Los Angeles, Miami, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Kiev, and Sofia. Then, to sweeten the pot, El Al customers will be exempted from any fees for changing canceled flight tickets until the end of February 2021. With plans to resume flights to other destinations as soon as restrictions allow. But that said, many Israelis are still wary of traveling, especially given the 2-week quarantine requirements that Israelis must abide by upon their return. Also, foreign passport holders are still largely banned from entering the country at all. So hopefully this light resumption of activity will hold the company afloat following its massive and near-fatal financial crisis, alleviated only recently by Israeli-American yeshiva student Eli Rosenberg, who just purchased the majority share of the company at a cool $107 million. Now, speaking of the economy, companies in Israel and all over the world have been forced to get pretty creative during the ongoing pandemic, with the alternative for many being bankruptcy or worse. So how are business leaders evolving and adapting? Here to discuss is ILTV contributor and consumer behavior expert, Dr. Vili Abraham. Thank you so much for being there.
It's a pleasure.
All right, so, first of all, let's start off with some data. What is the unemployment rate currently?
Well, if we look at what happened a month ago, there were 740,000 Israelis unemployed. So we're talking about 18.2% unemployment rate. And 14th of October, over 20% unemployed. So we're talking about 947,000 Israelis out of work. And just before the lockdown, we had 910. So it means that as a result of the lockdown, 40 more thousand Israelis found themselves without work.
Well, and that's just what we know of as well. Those are just the registered unemployed. So, what are some of the workarounds that maybe some companies have started employing to get around these lockdown measures?
All right, well, for example, if you're a grocery store and you may have also a coffee machine and you sell coffee, although it's not legal, you're not allowed to sell coffee.
Of course.
So, for example, a lot of supermarkets started selling toys because you cannot go to a toy store and buy toys for your kids. So they're offering toys. So there are all sorts of things going on in order to get around the
but
regulations.
that's a company that's so-called essential. It's a food provider, and so they're already allowed to open, and they're maybe just expanding on their business as much as they can. But what about some of the companies that are not essential?
All right, well, there's some interesting stories. For example, a store in Holon, which actually sells clothing, what the business owner did is just put a few, cartons of fruits and vegetables at the entrance to the shop, and then it became legal because you're selling.
Just like that.
It's incredible. I mean, these things that people were doing. Look, I mean, business owners are really, really, really desperate, and you can see this across the whole country and in different industries. Okay, from people who are selling clothing or food and to the hospitality industry as well.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I for example, just bought a portable hard drive out of a store that was selling. He had blocked off the entrance to the store, and he would just have the customers come up to the door and say, "I want that. How much is it?" And he did the whole interaction within the store, and then just brought it to me outside. So the question is, where does he stand legally? Is he liable to get in trouble, or is that sort of a gray area?
Well, if we're talking about computers and telecommunications, I think that's legal. That's perfectly legal.
This is an office supply store.
Office supplies, well, I know that there is a large office supply chain in Israel which is allowed to operate, and it's completely legal. But if you look at places that sell computers or fixed telephones, that's perfectly fine. However, you do find places that sell food. They're supposed to deliver it, but if you come up to the store or to the shop and you say, "I want, something, sushi," they'll give it to you.
Yeah, they're probably
and it just seems that there are not enough inspectors around to give the fines and to enforce the lockdown rules.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, well, so what companies are really out of luck then, that are really so far removed from any of these workaround or loopholes?
All right, so we're talking about all companies or business owners that are not in the essential products business. So we're talking about owners of, a wedding hall, bars, etc. These people have no way to open their shops or to open their businesses to the general public. But if you're selling something like clothing and you put something in front of your store that is essential,
right.
Then you get around it.
Well, maybe the bars and clubs, etc., can
there are even cases
of
of companies delivering to their customers that are waiting outside by some bench. And if you look at bakeries, for example, you're allowed to sell food that is prepared in advance, but you're not allowed to sell coffee. But of course, if somebody comes in, you offer him coffee.
So it's really just a matter of finding those little tiny loopholes. And kind of grabbing onto them. All right, Dr. Abraham, thank you so much for being with us today.
It was a pleasure.
Moving on, a shocking display broke out on base between IDF soldiers this week, and it's now ending in strict punishments. This after some 30 soldiers in the Givati Brigade's training base got into a fight over the entrance line for a meal, which the IDF calls irregular and severe and not in line with the Army's values or expected behaviors. Still, 21 soldiers were injured in the nearly 10-minute fight, 8 needing hospitalization. And the Army is reporting that all of the soldiers involved in the violence and all of their commanders who failed to prevent the incident will be dealt with harshly, including commanders of the platoons and teams. Training exercises for the weekend have also now been halted. And taking a different turn now, Israeli soldiers had a very busy evening overnight. The Israeli police and the IDF revealing a number of serious operations. 2 IDF soldiers have been wounded in Judea and Samaria, or near Nablus of the northern West Bank, Tuesday night. The IDF spokesperson reporting that one soldier was lightly wounded and the other moderately wounded by what appears to be shrapnel from an explosive device that was thrown at their unit during a pre-dawn arrest raid. The unit was in the midst of arresting a Palestinian suspect in the Balata refugee camp, and the 2 injured soldiers have since been transferred to hospital for treatment. But according to security officials, this is far from the only activity overnight Wednesday morning. Israeli police reportedly stopping and arresting 2 suspects from the town of Segev Shalom as they carried nearly 60 illegal guns thought to have been smuggled across Israel's southeastern border. Meanwhile, border police operating overnight in East Jerusalem arrested another 2 suspects and took them in for questioning after uncovering parts of an M16 rifle, stun grenades, and ammunition in a residential compound. And finally, in perhaps the biggest announcement made Tuesday evening, Israeli military officials confirming an operation conducted last week over the border to the north. A secret force of IDF Special Forces shown now crossing into the demilitarized zone between Israel and Syria to destroy 2 Syrian army outposts. And this reportedly in response to continued Syrian violations of the disengagement agreement between Syria and Israel signed in 1974, specifically that no military posts can be erected within the UN-designated buffer area. Speaking of border disputes, Israel and Lebanon, neighboring nations still technically at war, are finally making serious moves towards mediating their shared boundary lines. Nittany Manson reports.
UN and U.S. brokered talks once again paving the way for the state of Israel to potentially make peace with its neighbors. Israeli and Lebanese officials now gearing up for landmark meetings, intent on settling the maritime border dispute between the 2 Mediterranean nations, specifically in light of the discovery of oil and gas off their shared coastline. And granted, it's no full normalization agreement like the Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, but it's still a huge step forward, making for the first real border talks between the 2 nations in 30 years. That said, both sides are calling for expectations to remain tempered, Israeli officials in Jerusalem stressing that the discussions will only be for the sake of delineating territorial waters ahead of future drillings and exploration, and not for setting the stage for any sort of normalization. Lebanon likewise saying these negotiations are purely technical, with their delegation consisting of 2 army officers, a maritime border law expert, and a Lebanese oil magnate. Meanwhile, Iranian terror proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, taking things one step further, blasting the Lebanese delegation ahead of their first meeting with their Israeli counterparts. A pro-Hezbollah daily on Monday even going so far as to call this a moment of unprecedented political weakness for Lebanon. But with massive blocks of fuel up for dispute while Lebanon faces a years-long and deepening financial crisis, it appears that this moment could be one of the solutions that Lebanon needs.
All right, now some very exciting news for Israeli company Blue White Robotics, which in spite of the coronavirus pandemic has just announced that it will be opening a command and control center in the Tech Garden in Syracuse, New York. New York Governor Cuomo himself applauding the move, signed with assistance from the state and through private investments. Now, Blue and White Robotics, based in Tel Aviv, develops a robot-as-a-service platform for the operation of multi-autonomous robot and drone systems. And it's used primarily in agriculture, public transportation, energy, mining, and emergency first response. But specifically, the platform allows for a centralized command and control of complex data-driven operations that utilize multiple air and ground-based unmanned vehicles. And the company says that for its upcoming New York facility, they plan to station their operations, marketing, and sales teams at a cost of a little over $4 million. Staying in the United States now for this next item, a new Pew Research poll has just been conducted ahead of the upcoming 2020 presidential elections, claiming that upwards of 70% of American Jews plan to vote for Democratic nominee Joe Biden, as well as the majority of nearly every other religious group in America. Here to unpack the results is author of the new book, Broken Values: How the Democratic Party Platform Betrays Its Followers and America, Gideon Israel. Gideon, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here.
All right, so first of all, that is quite the title, and we're going to get back to that in just a second. But first, I want to ask you, are you surprised by this poll?
No, not at all. Usually, the Jewish vote is somewhere between 65 and 75% for the Democratic Party candidate. Sometimes it's close to 80% with Obama and with President Clinton. But it's really, I don't think it's ever dropped below 60%. I think, except for Jimmy Carter.
So why do you think that is?
Well, I think sometimes people think that if you're Jewish, therefore you're going to vote based on what the candidate's policy towards Israel is. I think Jews, like other Americans, vote based on their values. So, for example, when Eric Cantor was the House Majority Leader for the Republicans, his support for Israel, I think, was based on his conservative values. As you know, and when Jews vote for a candidate, meaning it wasn't based on his Jewish values. And when Jews vote for a candidate, they vote based on their values. And most Jews in America are liberal, so therefore they're voting for the Democratic Party.
All right, well, so I'm going to get to this book now, Broken Values: How the Democratic Party Platform has betrayed America. How then does this Pew Research poll fall into this? What's your analysis of this poll then?
Well, first of all, what my book does is it takes a look at the Democratic Party over the last 30 years since the Clinton era. Some people think that the Democratic Party is still the party of Scoop Jackson, the party of Bill Clinton, party that was very pro-Israel, party where there was room for everybody, anti-discrimination, and so forth. And what I try to show in my book is that it's a very different party today. And not only that, the change has been very rapid. But what I do in the book, and that's what's very unique, is that I use the party platform. I use the Democratic Party's own words on about 10 different issues, including Israel, to show what the Democrats looked like in the 1990s and what they look like today.
Okay, so where do Biden and Harris fall in today with this platform?
So I think one mistake is some people think that Joe Biden, since he's been in the Senate for almost 100 years, they think that he's going to be a Clinton Democrat, a Clinton-era Democrat. And the truth is, the party has drifted, and he has drifted with the party. I think one of the things we saw on the party platform, this is the most pro-Palestinian platform ever. And but I think to sort of look to see where the Democratic Party stands on Israel, it's not enough to look at the most, left-wing flank, the anti-Semitic congresswomen, Tlaib and Omar. I think one important person to look at is actually Chuck Schumer. He's probably one of the most pro-Israel senators, people in Congress. And look at how he's drifted. 10 years ago, he wasn't willing to speak at the J Street conference. He did last year. He was diametrically opposed to the anti-settlement policy of the Obama administration. Now he signed on a letter saying to Benjamin Netanyahu, don't apply sovereignty over to these areas. But even more, he supported Keith Ellison to be the chair of the Democrat National Committee after the 2016 elections. This is someone that Chaim Saban, lifelong Democrat, called an anti-Semite. This is someone that Alan Dershowitz said, if he's elected, I'm out of the party. And Chuck Schumer still stood by him. So I think, and also on the Iran deal, even though he was against the Iran deal, he wasn't willing to convince his colleagues. And as opposed to Senator Menendez, who was vocally opposed, he said, there's good, there's bad, but I'm against. So I think looking at him and looking how far he's drifted from the Chuck Schumer who was against the Oslo Accords, very, very, critical, we can see how far the Democrat Party has moved.
All right, well, it sounds like there's a lot to unpack in this topic. For anybody who's looking to learn more about what's going on right now with the Democratic Party, check out Broken Values, How the Democratic Party Platform Betrays Its Followers and America. It's available now on Amazon. Gideon Israel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, moving on, our final story tonight. Wonder Woman and Israeli Hollywood star Gal Gadot is making headlines again this week, after first stirring the public with the announcement of her new role as the Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra. But this time, Gadot's in the limelight sharing some Hebrew slang on Instagram with her crew from Vanity Fair. Take a look.
That's a good one. Para para means cow, cow. And it's basically when you go and you do something, you do it para para. You do it slowly but surely, one step at a time. Para para, cow, cow. This one I use all the time. Bli ayin hara. Bli ayin hara in English means no evil eye, and that's basically what it means, against evil eye. Bli ayin hara. I also add bli ayin hara, khamsa, 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 khamsa. Two. Against evil eye. Bli ayin hara.
All right, now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be clear and comfortable again, with lows around 66 or 19 degrees Celsius. And tomorrow you can expect clear to partly cloudy skies with an average high of around 86 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. And now before we go, of course, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Oh my God, is that a pug in a hammock? You guys, do they make pugs hammocks now? That's a thing? Oh, he looks so comfortable. He's too little. No, he's fine. Oh, my heart is so warm right now. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.39 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.